because it's such a unique situation when we start getting into some specialty crops, market farms, hobby farms, small scale production, it can bring about some different questions than maybe are typical than when we do some of our larger scale projects. Before I do get started, I do want to encourage anyone, if you aren't familiar with who the Natural Resource Conservation Service is, just as Kate said, we are located in any county. You can look us up, find our offices, speak to us in person. We're there to serve you. We assist with any resource concern you may have related to soil, water, air, your plants, your livestock. We can help you address that. We did an earlier presentation at the beginning of this series. At that time, I was wearing a different hat as outreach coordinator, and I was able to go over our various offerings from technical assistance to financial assistance. So I definitely encourage anyone watching this today to, if you haven't seen that, to check it out so you can get more detail about our services. Today, I'm going to talk about what my passion and full-time position is, and that is really the wildlife and the habitat side of it. And so you might be asking, like, why would we even worry about this when we have a homestead, when we have a market farm, when we're working in this setting? What are we really worried about with habitat? You've got enough on your plate already with your production system. And the reality of it comes to it may depend on what your interest is with the wildlife habitat, but we really need to acknowledge that 1 out of every 3 bites of food is thanks to a pollinator, and pollinators are wildlife. So what does that look like? Well, this is a really fancy grocery store. This is actually a series of pictures that have been put out for many, many years now. But this fancy grocery store, as you can see, is full of a wide variety of produce. Many, probably not the citrus, are produce you may produce on your farm yourself. Without pollinators, this is what it would look like. What we're seeing here are probably seedless oranges that are grafted, so pollinators aren't really involved in that. We're seeing root vegetables like onions or maybe something like asparagus that's not based on flowering, it's based on a stalk. So those are things that the production of the food component of that item is not as reliant upon pollinators in that process. And so what we're really talking about is taking advantage of the wildlife habitat to maximize your harvest. And that can be whether that's anything you see in this picture. But it's also about not only the pollination that comes from that, but how do we prevent loss of that production due to pests? And so in that circle image you see in the sort of lower left-hand side there, that is a wheel bug. A wheel bug's in the assassin bug family. They are voracious predators. They will definitely land a punch if you bother them too much. But we want to have these as well in our spaces, in our production areas, to help keep those pest populations down. So this is not just about the pollinators, but about our beneficial insects too. And so beneficial insects, by definition, are going to fall as those pollinators, those that are going to increase pollination into moving pollen from one plant to another. It's the predatory insects, so those that are directly going to eat something. And that's what the ladybug here in this image is going to show you. The another predatory bug that people don't often realize is a predatory beetle are lightning bugs. So they're obviously such an important and fun part of our summer. All of us get excited about seeing them, but in their larval form, which is in the, let's see if I can get my pointer. Oh, that's not going to work. Give me 1 second. Let's see if I can get my laser, which is over here in this lower corner of the lightning bug picture here. That is its larval state. Actually, if you go out at this time of year, you may start to see little glowing spots in your lawn or out in your fields, and that is the glowworm, and that is that larval state of the lightning bug. And in that state, they are voracious slug predators, just incredible in their impact on that. We also have the parasitoids, which are these wasps. If you grow tomatoes, you've probably seen a tomato hornworm, and if you've seen a tomato hornworm with these little white dots on the back of it, that's a sign that the wasp has already been there. As gross as it may be, leave that hornworm there. It may eat a few more of your tomato leaves, but we want those predator wasps to hatch. And I'm not going to lie, parasitoids are pretty gross in their process, but they do an amazing job of helping to keep our pest populations in check. So we actually do want to encourage those to hatch when we see those situations. And of course, we've talked about the beetles and we talked about the wasps, but we'd also be remiss to not acknowledge the impact of flies as well. The hover flies we're all seeing now, we often blame them to be sweat bees. They are bee mimics. They do offer some pollination services out there, but in their larval form, they're also voracious predators. So they serve dual purposes out there. So by providing them habitat as well, we're really getting that double benefit. Our soil beneficial insects also fall into this category, and I'm not going to really cover them here. They're doing a lot of work underground. So if you caught the soil health presentation on this YouTube channel, you can learn all about our soil beneficials. All right. So while we have lots of individuals who are doing this because they know they can get that increase in production, that pest management benefit, some individuals are doing it just because butterflies are pretty, because the flowers are pretty, because these cute little longhorned bees in the middle picture here are some of the most adorable little bees you'll find. And this is an image from my own garden where they were just sleeping in the morning and had not risen to start their work for the day. Or we have the metallic sweat bee over here on some mountain mint, just adorable little bees out there. And so whether it's songbirds that are your passion, butterflies, bees, maybe some other wildlife species, it's okay to just want to put some habitat out there just because. Now, there's a lot of reasons people want the pollination services, obviously, and of course, honeybees are one way to do that. But I do, as a wildlife biologist, want to clarify that there's a lot of differences in between the honeybee and our native bees. And the impact of the honeybees and what you are doing on your farm can have a big impact on the native bees as well. So honeybees really are a domestic animal. They were brought here from Eurasia. They live in hives, as everyone knows, especially if you've participated in the beekeeping exercises with veterans in farming. These colonies can be tens of thousands of bees, and they overwinter as a colony. So they are trying to get enough food that they can build up stores so that they can overwinter as a much smaller colony than they are in the summer, but they're still going to overwinter with many, many bees. So we're looking at tens of thousands of bees going out in the landscape. They are an important pollinator for many of our crops, including the orchard crops. That's part of the reason they were brought here in the first place. But they have a big impact on the environment. When we look at our native bees, and what you see here is actually the life cycle of a bumblebee hive, which is one of the few other hives that there are out there. The bumblebees only overwinter as a queen. So only the queen is overwintering. She's hibernating underground. She emerges in the spring. She's going to generate some workers and some drones. And once those workers go out, she stays in the hive and focuses on laying eggs for the next generation. Eventually, they're going to generate more queens. They're going to go out, disperse so that they can make more hives in the landscape, and then they overwinter as individuals. So there's not that demand for getting that food resource built up over the winter. We're really focusing on getting that queen health built up over the winter. For most of our other bees, they're solitary. It is just the female bee that is managing the eggs and the larvae and getting them what they need to make the next generation. So you don't even see that hive support at all. They're just doing it on their own. And so when you have a honeybee hive out there, all of those workers working together for one goal can really overwhelm a native bee population very quickly. So it's important to make sure we have lots of resources so that we can support both. Because there are some species that you're growing in your garden that your honeybees cannot pollinate. Tomatoes, for instance, only our bumblebees can help with the pollination of that. And there is lots of evidence that the pollination done by our native bees in our orchard settings and in other places is immensely beneficial and really increases our production every year. So there's a place for both, but we want to make sure those resources exist for both out there. And also recognizing that when we start talking about putting native habitat out on the landscape, our honeybees did evolve in Europe. And so they're more familiar with those plants that would have been in that setting. So we have a lot of native species that they'll use. There's a lot of native species that they don't. And it also can take 2 to 3 years to get blooms in our native plants. They spend a lot of time putting down their root resources. For solitary species, that's okay. Getting a few blooms every year is still going to sustain these smaller populations, but it is not enough to sustain a hive. So we need that benefit, the balance of both the introduced plants that the honeybees may need to balance out their food, so clovers and things like that, as well as the native plants that will support our native populations, also provide some additional food sources for our honeybees, and make sure that there's plenty of space for both. I do like to joke that saying that we're conserving pollinators by saving honeybees is like saying that we're going to conserve our wild bees by keeping chickens is the same as, or using honeybees to save native pollinators is the same as saying that we're keeping chickens to save quail. They're very different in their needs. They're in the same family. They eat very similar items, but how we manage them is very different. And obviously one's domesticated and one is wild. So why wouldn't you want to have some wildlife habitat? I'm obviously a wildlife biologist. I'm always for more habitat when we can get it, but there are reasons why on your farm habitat may not be the best choice. One of those, of course, is you are bringing wild animals in, and wild animals do what wild animals do. So on the left here is an ironweed plant. That ironweed is a beautiful plant. It serves the butterflies love it at this time of year, but it's also a really sturdy plant and birds like to perch on it, which means birds are going to do what birds do on that plant. And if that plant is next to your production bed, you could be inviting that kind of behavior and potential cross-contamination to your production area. So you want to be very aware of how close you are putting these plantings and this habitat near your beds for that reason. In addition, when you start getting into hedgerows and some of those living hedgerows that are so important right now, where we see people producing elderberries and aronias and hazelnuts and different things that are great for production, great for wildlife, that means not only are they going to attract the species you want, they're going to attract some species you don't want. In this case, these 3 are my children many, many years ago, and that's a possum they have in their bucket. It's what we do, I guess, for fun on the weekends. But this possum had gotten into our barn, and of course, that is not always where we want one. You're also going to risk attracting other pests to the area. Cute when they're little, but can be quite destructive to your farm. And of course, some of them are really cute, but they're going to eat your produce as they go as well too. So there are reasons to be very conscientious as to why you may or may not want this habitat near your farm and how to lay it out in the process to minimize the damage that these cute but pesky critters can cause. Also of consideration is if your farm does include livestock, particularly birds, attracting more wildlife to the area, you do run the risk of some zoonotic disease spread. And of course, highly pathogenic avian influenza has been in the news a lot lately. It does exist in the environment. It is in wild bird populations. How comfortable you are with how close that wildlife comes is something you need to consider for your farm, and where you want that habitat to be in relation to any livestock you have is something you need to consider. And that's not something we're going to cover today. That is an individual farm's choice. It varies homestead to homestead, farm to farm, but that is something to consider as you're developing where to place this habitat. So when I'm talking about habitat, what am I talking about? What these species need, whether it's an insect or a bird or a mammal, is going to be the same things that you need every day, and that's food, cover, water, and space. Space, obviously, is going to be dependent on the species you want. So if you have a lot of land and you have a large space to do it, you can get larger wildlife. So a whole field is something that many of our larger landholders will often consider. It could be anywhere from 1/10 of an acre to 80 acres. It just depends on what works for that land and the objectives of the landowner. And of course, the larger that landscape is, the more wildlife it will support, and the larger the wildlife it will support. So again, what are your objectives? What are you trying to attract to the area? But it doesn't have to be big. And that's the great thing about conservation of insects and songbirds, is that small areas bring them in very quickly. And so you get almost instant gratification, which is always exciting to see. So you can see, I keep using this backyard herb garden in pots. You can have plants in pots and attract pollinators. You can have a milkweed growing in a pot and be a potential host for a monarch larva. So the size for these species isn't as critical as it is for some of our larger species, which really makes it nice when you have a small space. As far as food goes, you might be thinking, well, they're here, they're pollinating my plants, they're getting food from the food that I'm growing myself, which is absolutely true. So one of the reasons that this relationship works is that the pollinators are growing to our crop plants, they're grabbing the nectar or the pollen, and then they're moving that to other flowers. So that gives us or our plants the opportunity to be pollinated and produce fruit, and they are going back to wherever their nests are, and they're taking that pollen and nectar with them. However, our crops are only in flower for very brief periods of the year. We're talking, days or weeks for some of them, depending on what it is. You might only get a week of blackberry flowers. You may only get 2 weeks of apple blossoms. And so if you want these species to remain around, especially if you're going to really emphasize the use of these native species, then you have to provide a food source for them the rest of the year. Otherwise, they're going to need to go somewhere else, and then they may not be inclined or able to return in future years. What we're really looking at is providing a wide range of timing of blooming, the color of those blooms, and the shape of the blooms to maximize the diversity of species that we can support and to give them a diversity of food throughout the year. So when we look here on this screen, these flowers on the left are all early blooming plants. This is redbud. Don't neglect our early blooming trees like redbud and black locust. They are a great pollinating food source and often out before many of our other wildflowers are. But we can have other species. Many of you are familiar with columbine. We have foxglove beard tongue, a penstemon, golden alexanders. These are all different species that can be there early in the spring, just as these insects are emerging when the first warm-up occurs, and they're there to provide that food source. As we move into late summer, we get into those species we're more familiar with, like purple coneflowers or cardinal flowers. And of course, we're now at what I like to call the golden season of the year, when we're looking at goldenrods and black-eyed Susans and sunflowers. We do have the sprinkling of purples out there with the New England asters and some of the legumes. So you'll see that color shift happen throughout the year. You'll also see different shapes of those flowers throughout the year. Some species are more adapted for tubular flowers. Some species need the asters or those disc flowers. So the more variety you can provide, the more species you'll support, and the more species you support, that greater diversity you're going to see out there. in greater success for your crops as well. For cover and shelter, it really depends on what species we're talking about. A number of our native bees are ground-dwelling bees, so having spaces where they can get to the ground in that bare dirt setting is important. They also will nest in dead wood, so we have, having stumps or rotting wood out there is a great place for some of those bees as well. Our beetles will be in the ground as well, under debris or under bunch grasses. So we want to make sure that they have a habitat where they can ultimately breed and nest. So as I said, the beetles really do prefer or will go to places under bunch grasses to nest. So that's an important component. We've been talking a lot about floral resources, the wildflowers themselves, but we don't want to neglect that these bunch grasses are a very important component of the habitat too. We can construct those nests out there. So these are all man-made. These do require maintenance. I can't vouch for the success of all of them. I have had success with these tubes. And then we can also look at beetle banks, which is a way to construct a earthen structure that provides a place that those beetles can burrow into under the grasses and directly in the field of production. And they need water. And that water needs to be accessible. So in the case of this fountain, that is flowing water, but it's shallow. So these are some bees that can get down into that water. And then a shallow dish with rocks is another way to access it, because we want to avoid these buckets where the bees can get in there and they can't get out. And lastly, the where. Where do you want to put this? So you would want to look at your farm out on the site and decide, where is it going to go? And none of this is the same wherever it is, but you want to look at it in relation to those production areas. So as close as possible to the target crop, safe from pesticide drift. Pests travel farther than predators, so having habitat in multiple locations. And the more habitat, the closer, and the yield can definitely go up. And there's some data to support that. And the how. So when we look at these larger plantings, we're often looking at this from the perspective of using large-scale equipment. So discs to prepare the site, drills or broadcast spreaders to spread seed. We're almost always talking about seed, because hand planting a site that's over just a few hundred square feet is just a lot of work and very challenging. So these larger sites are definitely going to be looking at that from a seeding perspective, where we may see plug plantings when we get to these smaller sites. So looking at native species out on the sites using plugs. So here with NRCS, we do this through a practice standard called the 420 Wildlife Habitat Planting. And we do have financial assistance programs such as EQIP that will assist with that. And in EQIP, we have different levels of support that we can do for that. When we're talking about small farms, we're almost always talking about doing that for pollinator plantings. As we mentioned, these small plantings don't support large wildlife. So we would expect to at least do the minimum of 4 or 9 forb species, so 9 wildflower species. And if we're seeding it, we're looking at a minimum seeds per square foot as well. But you can also do that with a plug planting. So we do have the ability to support or provide financial assistance to plant actual plugs in that spot. You still need those minimum of 9 forb species, but we're looking at 1 plug per square foot, not looking at 25 seeds per square foot. It's a different way to measure it. And so that financial assistance is out there to support that. And which way you go and which ones you decide to use really depends on your needs. So we're looking at the availability of the plants, the scale of what you're going to plant out there. Plugs, if that's the way you want to go, the more plugs you buy, the less cost it is per plug. So smaller plantings, actually, the plugs can be quite costly, and it's something you definitely have to weigh as you're looking at it. We want to make sure that there's no pesticide used on those plugs. If you go to certain locations, some of those plugs or plants that are grown for landscaping may have been treated to prevent pests from damaging the plant or making them look unattractive. And we definitely don't want that if we're trying to attract insects to the spot. and realize that there is going to be weeding that comes with this, that you're going to want to keep those weeds out so they don't move into your production beds, and then long-term maintenance as well. So while all of this is going to really benefit your operation, it's going to provide some aesthetic beauty to the site, it's going to provide that habitat, there are some costs that are associated with that that need to be considered as you can look at it within your operation. Hedgerows are another growing in popularity practice that we offer. This is offered on a linear foot basis, and it's going to use a combination of shrubs or bunch grasses and some native forbs to create linear structures that provide that habitat for wildlife. And there's a number of reasons why people may do it. There's a number of purposes that we can do it for. Habitat being the primary one, to provide that food, cover, and corridor for wildlife, enhance those pollen and nectar resources. Also, it's an opportunity to provide other benefits to your farm you may consider, such as intercepting those airborne particulate matter or preventing chemical drift, being a screen to barriers or noise and dust, a living fence in general. So there's other reasons to do hedgerow, so it's a nice way to do some combination habitat and other benefits for your farm. And that is, as I said, a combination of those woody plants or perennial bunch grasses in that linear structure. We have resources that can help you select the species for that, but I'm going to leave that to the next presentation. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and if we have time and space, ask if there's any questions.
Thanks, Brianne. That was really informative. Are there any practices that you see most commonly used in Indiana? Are the hedgerows one of them?
Hedgerows are just now growing in popularity. There are other states where they are the primary practice, especially when you start looking at specialty crop farms in California. But we're seeing an increasing interest in them here, especially as our specialty crop and market farms continue to grow in number here. So that's one that I think we'll continue to see that interest in. 420 wildlife habitat planting is by far our #1 wildlife planting and establishment practice.
Great, thank you. Mary, take it away. If you have any problems sharing your screen, just let me know.
Sure, absolutely. Before I share my screen, I'd just like to introduce myself. Thank you for those that are able to tune in today. And thanks to Kate and our webinar hosts, and grateful to Brianne for the amazing resources that you shared. I'm excited to be here on behalf of Pollinator Partnership today, and just thrilled that those that are tuning in are interested in making an impact positive for pollinators. Let me get my screen shared and start my presentation. Great. Can you hear me okay? Can you see everything okay?
Yeah, are you able to make it larger?
Oh.
If not, no worries.
Yeah. So it's interesting.
It's okay.
I am not able to make it larger. I apologize.
We can see it. That's fine.
Okay. And something is going on with my video. Are you able to see me, or should I just hide it?
That's all right.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to go through some of the pollinator practices on the farm. Let me make sure I have hidden as many things as I can so I can see my screen. So just to talk a little bit about Pollinator Partnership. We are the world's largest nonprofit dedicated exclusively to the health of pollinators and animals. Since 1997, we've championed the vitality of pollinators critical to food and ecosystems through conservation, research, education, and collaboration. And as the Indiana partner biologist, I assist landowners, NRCS agent, and other agency staff with pollinator habitat technical assistance and conservation planning. And I also provide pollinator habitat related outreach and education for the agricultural community. So an overview, and I'm going to probably skip through a few things so that we don't have too much repetition, but I'll go ahead and just give you an overview of what we'll talk about today. So get a little more in depth on pollinators and their diversity, talk a minute about the status of pollinators, and just another touch on a point on their needs. And then we'll go into more depth on practices for pollinators on the farm and resources for assistance, additional ones. So I would be remiss if I didn't kind of talk about pollination 101, just to make sure we're all on the same page. But pollination is the process of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of the flower to female stigma of the flower with the goal of creating a viable seed. And so animal pollination is very common. 90% of our world's vascular plants require pollination, and by animals specifically, and our common pollinators we've already talked a little bit about. So to go into a little bit more detail, we talked about this, but we know about 75% of the world's crops are dependent on pollination. That 1 out of 3 bites, we can't forget it. And they're also essential to our ecosystems. So those services support our native plant communities upon which wildlife depend. And they also help regulate climate by sustaining our vegetation and supporting ecosystem biodiversity. And this is just kind of an overview because there's so many shapes and sizes of pollinators, and just to give you a perspective worldwide, and I think that 20,000 is actually for North America. It looks like something got cut off there. Of those 20,000 bee species in North America, we have 4,000 bee species in North America. I know what I'm, apologies. Let me go back to clarify. 20,000 of the pollinator species worldwide are bees. And so we have about 3,600 bee species here in Indiana, in the US, and about 400 in Indiana. So those are native bee species. And then going into more depth on the butterflies and moths, which are collectively known as Lepidoptera. Here in North America, we have 1,200 or 12,000 species, if you, depending on your source. And then in Indiana, we have 144 species of butterflies and over 2,000 species of moths. And then the reason for our concern, thanks to this graphic from the Xerces Society, we're showing 19% of our butterfly species are at risk of extinction worldwide. That classic example of the monarch whose population declines have been pretty drastic, over 90% in a short 20-year period. Of the 4,000 bee species in the US, more than half are experiencing population declines, and about 25% are at risk of extinction. And then we have a 75 research showing that there's been a 75% decline in flying insects in a period of less than 30 years. So reasons for their decline are loss of habitat due to changes in practices in agriculture, as well as development, urbanization, sprawl, and so forth. Also pathogens and parasites, especially we know them to be the case for honeybees, but they also are an issue with our native bees as well as monarchs, for example, and overuse or misuse of pesticides. And a lot of that's tied to some changes in practices on the landscape. And then as a result of some of the things that are happening with climate change, we're having a mismatch between flower bloom and when that plant is on the landscape and when the pollinator is actually active during the year. And just to go into the importance of native plants and biodiversity, our native plants have co-evolved with our native fauna, and by native, we are talking about plants that have been here prior to European colonization. So prior to the introduction of other plants from elsewhere in the world. Native plants provide that really familiar and diverse food and shelter for our pollinators and other wildlife. And the bottom line is that enhancing and restoring native plant habitat can provide connectivity for improved biodiversity. And I won't go into detail because Brianne covered this very well, but you know, just that diversity of types of plants, trees, shrubs, grasses, wildflowers, and the diversity of bloom time. The recommendation for a lot of these NRCS practices is a minimum of 3 species per bloom period. So keep that in mind, and there's a lot of information out there that can help you choose plants based on their bloom time. And we talked also about foraging resources, but I just love seeing pictures of beautiful native flowers and pollinators. One other thing I'll touch on is providing a diversity of what we call host plants or larval host plants for a diversity of pollinators and other insects. So a lot of our insects, about 90% of herbivorous insects, rely upon some host specificity in order to complete their life cycle. So we have a lot of butterflies and moths that use specific species of plants in their caterpillar stage. And then Brianne had to bring up those longhorn beetles, which I also think are so cute. So I thought I'd feature the ironweed bee. It's also in the longhorn group that raises its young almost exclusively on the pollen of the ironweed species that we have here in Indiana and elsewhere. While we talked about honeybees are crucial for agriculture, their needs are not a good model to understand the broader needs of pollinators. So I won't talk too much about the ground nesting bees. We know 90% of them are solitary, and about 70% of those are the ground nesters, and 30% will nest in cavities or stems above ground. So having access to bare ground in our plantings is important. And then just to give examples of all the stem nesting bees, so bees that may nest in tunnels or cavities in dead wood or hollow or pithy stems. Just, you know, reiterating that having that mosaic or matrix of various types of plant communities is so important. So the more habitat and the more diverse habitat you can provide, and then also keeping habitat as unmanaged as possible in order to maintain it throughout the year is also an important factor in providing habitat. And then there's other wildlife. We're talking about wildlife that benefit directly from pollinator habitat. So many amazing birds depend on grasslands for nesting or various parts of their life cycle. Perfect foraging habitat for birds that eat insects. So many small mammals and rodents, which in turn can be food for our bird predators. So go into very quickly, and this will be kind of a slideshow because our time is somewhat limited, to talk about some scalable practices, starting from home and garden to farm and forest. And just to start thinking about, if you haven't already started, where you might consider including pollinator habitat. So the first thing you'll need to do is assess your site to decide where you might want to have a pollinator habitat project, whether you will enhance existing habitat that's there or whether you will create new habitat. You might consider that any unique features on your land, any existing habitat that you might need to manage to improve it, conversion of underperforming agricultural areas. And then if you have pollinators that you know that are there, maybe making sure to think about what species they might need to support their populations and any others that might be in need. So monarchs, for example. Sometimes planting more of what is already there and doing well makes a lot of sense. And then the more habitat, the better, the more diverse habitat, the better. But also it's important to avoid taking on more than is manageable. Habitats can be, as we talked about, composed of grasses and forbs, also known as wildflowers, trees and shrubs, or a mix, as could be done in a hedgerow practice. We've already talked about basic needs, so we won't go there, but Other things you can look for are remnant plant communities, wetlands, woodlots, woodland edges, fence lines, riparian or wetland area buffers, pastures, right-of-ways for utilities or roadsides. So at home, we all need to add pollinator habitat, and so you can bring it to your home for beauty or to enhance your own home garden or small urban practice or operation. So simple things we can do, of course, plant native plants. Native plants can make really great landscaping choices: grasses, wildflowers, trees, shrubs. There's an opportunity if you're having to mow a lot to eliminate some of your lawn space and add pollinator plots to save time, money, energy, reduce emissions if you're using gasoline power lawnmower. And then another thing you can do is provide soft landings, a term coined by Heather Holm, that you can basically stop mowing under the drip line of your tree, allow leaf litter to accumulate, maybe landscape with some shade perennials instead of having a turf grass area there, because that is an important site for overwintering habitat for a lot of types of pollinators and insects. Again, leave your stems and leaves. That's breeding habitat and overwintering habitat, providing the year-round flowering resources, and then the wise use of pesticide. One thing that I've started doing at my place is leaving more dead logs around. They can be decorative, and then also creating brush piles when they're in places that are out of the way. Another opportunity to add natives to your home landscape is if you have a drainage issue, you can convert that to a rain garden using plants that are ideal for those types of situations. And if you know anything about me, I will always advocate for taking the time to manage invasive species at home, to understand that you potentially can have native invasive species that are ornamental in your landscape and maybe considering replacing them. And there's a lot of methods, chemical, non-chemical, manual, mechanical, or a mixture that you might consider. And this is a picture of calorie pear that was on my commute to work, about 8 acres solid that just kind of grew up in a fallow field. Habitat on the farm, why we're here. Challenges can become opportunities. So if you have a low yield area due to poor soil, wet spots, pest pressure, any marginal areas would be ideal, such as seeps, bogs, caves, any right-of-ways, ditches, abandoned fields and edges, orchard understory is an opportunity depending on what you're interested in, and then pond edges and waterway corridors. Just a slideshow here, we won't talk in detail, but just pictures of slideshows, water riparian buffers, those windbreaks that could be used as pollinator habitat. Cover crops are pollinator habitat. They are visited by our native pollinators as well as honeybees. Marginal lands and wildflower strips. So just to give you some examples of what these look like. Pasture could be used for pollinator habitat depending on how you manage it. Utility right-of-ways are an amazing resource. And then retired farmland. And we talked a little bit about pasture, but providing uniquely native pasture forage, and then practices such as reduced and light tillage are also an option to help pollinators. And then again, invasive species management. We all have a different suite of invasives to consider managing on the farm. And again, those control methods are varied. You might even be able to add prescribed fire, depending on the size of your property and whether you have access to somebody that can provide an expert consultant on a burn plan. And then in the forest, so I'll just talk briefly about potential for pollinator habitat in the forest. So you can create or improve forest land, but you can also establish new woody invasive or woody natives. So you could do tree plantings, shrub plantings or a mix. You could do riparian buffers that are tree plantings or herbaceous riparian buffers, so anywhere around a waterway corridor. Brush piles, we talked about brush piles. You can build very large brush piles in the forest setting, especially if you're taking down invasive species. Nest boxes are an option for providing habitat in the forest as well as elsewhere, and then brush management for invasive species removal. Leaving snags or creating snags are an opportunity to provide habitat for pollinators as well as other wildlife, enhancing wetland areas in a forest setting such as a swamp, and then edge feathering to kind of provide a diversity of habitat from the wooded edge. And then, of course, invasive species management in the forest, a suite of invasives that are common to forest lands here in Indiana, and as well as the diversity of options for their management. So in summary, I would say landowners play a critical role in conservation. Approximately 61% of land in the US and 95.5% here in Indiana is privately owned. Private landowners have access to state, local, and federal conservation assistance programs, including the amazing programs available through the Farm Bill and NRCS and FSA. Conservation assistance programs vary, so it's really important to talk to your local agencies for additional information. And Pollinator Partnership has partner biologists as well as other Farm Bill biologists that are here to help you create habitat with NRCS and other local partners. So I've talked a little bit about my role, so I won't go any more detail, but I do want to let you know that I'm not the only one at Pollinator Partnership doing what I'm doing. So I've got a well spread out team of coworkers that are available to provide various levels of assistance for Farm Bill programs. And you can find them on our website, but their email addresses are here. And we do have a Habitat Heroes project. So I am looking for veteran farmers and other types of farmers who have implemented pollinator practices using Farm Bill programs and who would like to share their story with others to help inspire more people to implement pollinator practices on their lands. So if you're interested, I'll leave this up for one more second so you can scan that and maybe fill out our questionnaire. And that is specifically to Indiana and Ohio currently. And I just want to shout out to all the other amazing things that Pollinator Partnership is doing. We helped establish and are a big part still of the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. We have a bee-friendly farming program, a bee-friendly gardening program. Our project Wingspan is involved with collection of native seed for various types of habitat restoration. Each year, part of the NAPC Pollinator Week events include our annual poster, which some of you might have, that we create in partnership with a lot of other amazing agencies and nonprofits. We also have our Pollinator Stewardship certification program where we have some great educational resources and you become a certified pollinator steward. We've recently been involved with our BMD for honeybee disease reporting, so that's a great tool to consider. We have an online tool called the Find Your Roots tool that helps you locate native plants that are suitable to your region. And then we have a Bee Smart school garden kit that's available to educators that are interested. And that is it. I got through it.
Nice job. Thank you so much. So we've got a couple questions for you. What would you recommend for people that have apple orchards or some kind of fruit orchards to plant sort of in the understory between their apple trees?
That is a good question. And, you know, I actually just had someone interested in that, and I would kind of defer to see if Brianne would be able to help us with that particular scenario.
Oh, you just unmute.
On my video, but not that. So specifically looking at what we can do in apple orchards. So definitely looking at either of those practices that I mentioned, plus one other that actually I didn't mention. So the hedgerows are really popular, especially along the edges of orchards. They provide a nice buffer. they can provide some drift protection maybe from other fields in the area, and then they can also offer that habitat area that these species can either nest in or be present in for their additional food source, or a buffer strip. The other option is if you are going to be bringing in the honeybee hives in an apiary setting, we do have an introduced species practice that I didn't include in my presentation that will focus more, as I mentioned, in the rapid food source for honeybees. So it'll plant the clovers and chicories. It has some options of buckwheat and a few other more of our crop-based species, but they bloom very quickly and provide a massive food source for those bees. I always like to see a combination because, again, the native bees are really important and they provide a lot more services than we realize, and they need the native food sources, but the honeybees, if you're going to bring that apiary into your production area, you need clovers and rapidly producing food sources.
And then I was interested because in both of your presentations, you talked a little bit about certain pollinators that like bare ground. And, we're often always talking about cover crops and encasing the ground in plants. So can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Do you want me to take that, Mary?
I can take that. For these native wildflower and grassland plantings, the key is to have a good balance of what you consider grass to wildflowers. And those grasses, especially those warm season native French grasses, while they help stabilize the system and keep bad stuff out, they also have these amazing little areas at the base of each plant that provide that interface for those native bees to provide some ground nest access. So it's keeping the ground covered, but it's also keeping some access. And so another thing about these pollinator plantings is once they're established, theoretically the disturbance that happens is only happening to maintain it in that condition. So limited disturbance, not the entire planting each year, but maybe splitting it into thirds. So yeah, it's just a consideration, but that is an interesting perspective because it is a way of keeping the ground covered, but it's creating a mosaic in that system.
And then,
may I add real quick
yes,
to that
please.
too? I'm just going to give a plug back to the soil health videos that you offered a few weeks ago, and hopefully everyone can catch on your YouTube channel, because when we start looking at the soil health component to your farm, that's going to build the soil structure that these insects can use. And so there was actually a study about squash bees, which are much more effective at pollinating squash than honeybees are. They're out at a different time of day, and they like to nest in the ground. So if you use those soil health principles that were talked about by Amanda in that presentation and build that under your squash plants, then maybe you can attract those bees to directly underneath your squash, and then they don't have so far to go for breakfast, and they're going to have improved pollination. So there's a benefit of that soil health, which will, yes, we want it covered, but it is still a matter of that tilth and the structure of the soil as well that's important to consider. So check out that conversation as well.
And then for each of you, so if we have one of our veteran farmers who's just sort of getting started with a homestead backyard garden and wants to add a couple native plants in Indiana, what would you recommend as sort of your top 3 favorites that are a good economical choice and they're resilient to the winter time or the heat in the summer like we're having right now? What about you, Mary? What would be some of your favorites that you'd recommend? Oops, just on mute.
For smaller settings, for a wildflower, one that kind of that establishes fast and kind of persists on the landscape would be yellow cone flower, Retipida pinnata. And it has a long bloom period. So that's a good one to add. I feel like my top 3 may not be the most affordable and maybe because they're more unique. So I'm just trying to think of good ones to consider. I love little blue stem for smaller settings. one of my favorite native warm season grasses. And if you have the right setting, sedges are awesome. So they don't get enough praise, but sedges are grass-like plants that help stabilize systems. There's mostly a sedge for most conditions, though they tend to not do as well in full sun, like very dry, well-drained soils. So if you've got a wetter area, it's definitely something you want to see as a component in your seed or plug mix.
Cool. Thank you. What about you, Brianne?
So if you're just getting started and looking for those easy and really accessible, I think a go-to is always purple coneflower. Any of the purple coneflowers out there, they're generally readily available, though I highly recommend you make sure you're avoiding the various horticultural cultivars, which are the purple coneflowers that aren't purple. Stay away from those. They've been genetically altered in a way that we don't really know if they're as nutritious for wildlife as the native. I always love to see mountain mints. Any of the mints in any family are incredibly beneficial to a wide range of insects, and you'll always see them covered in those little bees. And I do have to second that it's always great to have a grass in there, and little blue, you can't go wrong with little blue stem. It's a nice structure and it's short, but very pretty in the fall as well.
And then Brianne, for you, so if we had someone who, doesn't have their full farm yet, and they just want to do their sort of a small, maybe a raised bed or something in the ground that's not a huge lot, how big a space do they need to be able to start working with NRCS?
So NRCS does not set size minimums for who we work with. For our programs, as I said, there is no size. There is a production component that has to come with that. But that can be very small in scope. How it will work ultimately on your property, you really need to get your local conservationist out there to talk through that and see if it is a good fit for our financial assistance programs. But the good news is that we can provide technical assistance or have partners like Mary or other farm bill biologists in other parts of the state that can be there to provide that technical assistance no matter what, whether you use our programs or don't.
Awesome. And so if someone came out to your property, and would they first, talk to you about some of the soil health principles, like maybe getting soil testing, or talk about your needs and, how often you're going to be able to go out and water newly established plants or that kind of thing, to just kind of help you come to a decision on what species you might pick?
Yes. So when our planners come out, we're really going to be looking at your objectives and where you are in your farming journey. And so everyone has different access to resources, what your land can support, and what resources are there are definitely going to matter. Certainly for our native plantings, we are going to want those to be as self-sufficient as possible. That's the benefit of them. But, if you can get them watered in those first couple of years, that helps. But that might be something that is going to be considered if you're in a particularly dry site. We may just focus on the drier plants. If your site's a little soggy, we may focus on those water plants. So it's all tailored to the individual site, and that's what makes our support and technical assistance very unique, in that we're available to help anyone out there for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate your time and just all the information that you shared. Before signing off, can you both just tell again where people should go for resources for the ones that you provided, just the website? Mary, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. So pollinator.org, it's an easy one to remember, has a lot of amazing resources on various types of pollinator topics. So check us out and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any assistance that we can help with. I'm based in South Central Indiana, so I have a region that I can get to in person or connect people with other partners elsewhere.
Awesome. And what about you, Brianne?
NRCS.USDA.gov, and then you can navigate through there to individual states or to find your local service center, as would displayed earlier in the presentation. To contact me directly, it's just my name with a period in between Brianne and Lowe at USDA.gov.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we look forward to having you join us again at a future webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.